Hello and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. This episode is part of our series on Exvangelicalism. And for this episode, we've interviewed the journalist Sarah McCammon, author of The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. Sarah combines her own story with her expert research as a journalist to produce a powerful and insightful insider account of the exvangelical experience. As of today, her book is now available in paperback, and you can find a link to buy it in the text of this podcast episode. I hope you enjoy listening.
So thanks so much for being with us, Sarah. I really enjoyed reading your book, and so I was very glad that you could take some time to sit down with us and talk a bit about exvangelicalism. I wonder if we could just start by you telling us a bit about what is exvangelicalism, how do people use that term, and what does it mean these days?
Well, it's a pretty new term. I think it probably dates back to about 2016 from the research that I did. It seems to have been coined by a podcaster named Blake Chastain, who has also written a book recently about exvangelical experiences. He was using it first, I think, as a hashtag, primarily on Twitter, and then it spread to other social media platforms. And, I'm always careful to say, I don't think exvangelicalism, to the extent that it is a movement or an ism, is just about politics, but I think it's inescapable to notice that it sort of gained some ground around 2016, when really the idea of what it meant to be particularly a white American evangelical was somewhat contested, and also sort of it became a central part of the conversation around kind of where the country was going. And I first became aware of this term, this hashtag, through my not through my own experience, but through my reporting as a political journalist covering that election, first the Republican primary and then the general election. And as somebody who had an evangelical history, when I actually heard somebody sort of in passing mention this term, exvangelical, as the way she thought about herself. And she said, particularly in that moment when, at the time, candidate Trump was becoming so aligned with the evangelical Christian movement, she felt like the movement just didn't represent her anymore. Now, in the book, I talked to a lot of people, some of whom felt that way as well, but others were motivated, or their sort of shift out of evangelical identities was catalyzed by, often a variety of events and experiences. But politics are part of it for a lot of people.
Yeah, that has been my sense as well, is that it seems like there's a long backstory for a lot of people, but 2016 was a moment when all of those people kind of looked around and realized that a lot of people were kind of feeling the same things, and those kind of stories came together in a way that gained a lot of new momentum, maybe.
Yeah, you said that the term became contested in 2016, but I guess a lot of people, it seems to me, felt as if the term had actually been co-opted by a particular group, right? And had narrowed in its meaning as a consequence.
Yeah, and when I say contested, I mean, I think like the rise of movements like exvangelicalism were sort of part of that contestation, saying, this idea of evangelicalism, I mean, it's always been a contested term, right? Historians and demographers and pollsters argue about what exactly it means and who exactly fits within it. But I think 2016 was a real tipping point where I was hearing a lot of people who, by a lot of measures, would be considered evangelical saying, whoa, what's going on here? This isn't who we are. While at the same time, the majority of their co-religionists were, at least in the US, were aligning with those ideas. I mean, again, I don't want to make it just about Donald Trump. I think there have been earlier movements that you could compare it to exvangelicalism, like the emergent church movement about 10 years before that, roughly.
I was a part of that. Yeah. I remember that.
Which was also in many ways about, rethinking some of the aspects of evangelical identity that, you arguably maybe needed to be modernized, or arguably were, at odds with the compassionate view of human sexuality, whatever the objection may be. And I think there are similarities between those movements, and there are some overlapping figures in them as well. But 2016 was kind of it was in many ways a new generation or a new moment to sort of talk about what evangelicalism was and meant. I mean, I personally, so I was aware of the emergent church movement. I was in my, I guess, early 20s then, mid 20s at that point, and, was having my own kind of very private, what you would now call deconstruction, although I never called it that. This is all new terminology that I think speaks to something a lot of people experience, but didn't exist when I was kind of coming of age. But it wasn't something that I was a part of. It was just something that was kind of happening out there. And I think one of the challenges is that evangelicalism or conservative Protestantism is just so big that it can be kind of hard to get a handle on what it is and where are the boundary lines. And, sometimes people will look at other conservative Protestants and say, well, that's not me, I'm this. And that may be true, but I think it's often one of the struggles I have with talking to outsiders is kind of just even trying to define terms and explain, the sort of interlocking and overlapping subcultures that exist around these ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much there. And there's so much, I mean, money and power tied up in pulling that identity in a certain direction or, grabbing those kinds of groups, both in kind of media and politics that often, has historically made it very fraught to everybody wants to speak as if this is one block and do a lot of work to sort of draw them together.
Well, exactly. And I also feel that people often define either evangelicalism or exvangelicalism out of their own experience and their own community, and they may not know how much that community is actually representative of the wider whole. So they may be sort of projecting their own experiences onto something without realizing that that's not actually what it is.
Yeah.
Or that what it is different depending on people's experiences.
Right. Yeah, because you find, I sometimes talk to people who, are part of a church that has been really wonderful and has never had scandals as far as they know and whatever. And when they hear about, abuse scandals and stuff throughout evangelicalism, they kind of dismissive of that because they're like, no, evangelicalism is good. And so it's always, I think, a fraught thing to connect these broader movements to your kind of personal experience and community. So one of the things I loved your book because I think you do such a good job of that, right? So you're kind of reporting on these broader things that are happening in the culture, but also connecting it to your own personal story, and sometimes talking about sort of your surprise that these broader things are happening given your experience, or other times making connections and saying this actually isn't too surprising because of these things all that through the 90s and the 2000s were already happening in my church. And one of the things that I really stuck out to me was that for you, 2016 wasn't necessarily the tipping point. Or this isn't going to go back to that, but much earlier or somewhat earlier. And you talk about how, let's see here, an important aspect of your experience is the fact that you were taught that you needed to fear the world and save the world, but that neither of those impulses felt right when you actually encountered people. I wonder if you could just tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, as I describe, and this isn't true for everyone, but my evangelical experience was very, very sheltered. And I think a lot of evangelicals will relate to what I talk about as the evangelical bubble, or a lot of us talk about as the evangelical bubble, this idea that, particularly if you're really active in church, if you're homeschooled or go to Christian school, and maybe even if you go to public school, but most of your friends are conservative Christians, or your parents are, very careful about kind of policing what you're exposed to in the larger culture, that there's this sense of being in, sometimes it's kind of an entertainment media bubble. And I certainly grew up in that, where not all, but a good percentage of the media that we consumed was being filtered through, evangelical broadcasters, publishers, textbook publishers, and the like. And then most of the people that we knew, or at least people that we were close with, that we had anything more than a casual connection to, almost all of them shared our belief system. So while we were aware that there were other ways of seeing the world out there, they were not that vivid, and they were, portrayed as being something kind of dangerous, sinful, lost, maybe dangerous and harmful to us, coming in, but also dangerous and harmful to themselves, so that there was a need to sort of go out and share what we knew, the truth that we had, with other people. And, so there's, and sometimes that impulse, I think, drives evangelicals to be very compassionate and to do work, charity work and work, on behalf of people in need, both at home and around the world. There's a lot of money that comes from, Christians of all kinds to do that kind of work. But there's often, a string attached to that, which is the need to proselytize and I think Christians would describe that as sharing the good news, sharing their beliefs, but at the same time, that often means saying, that what you believe is not right, and you need to change your entire belief system and lifestyle. And, that was something that I always found just really uncomfortable. I starting out with street witnessing as a teenager, going out with, my youth group and being told to hand out these chick tracts, with which people may be familiar with, that, have this real dire fire and brimstone view of the afterlife. And there's something about going up to people and who I didn't know and basically telling them that I knew all the answers, that I felt dishonest as a 13, 14, 15-year-old, to do that, because I was still figuring out so much myself. A big character in my book is my grandfather, who was probably the person I was closest, not Christian. And, there was just this huge focus when I was growing up on trying to convert him, on praying for him at every meal. And every time we didn't spend a lot of time with him, and I go into why a little bit in the book, but when we would see him, on Christmas and so forth, there was this sense that we needed to be on our best behavior and be sort of a light that would shine and, help him to see that he was, he had gone astray, and
so win him over. Yeah.
He didn't seem like somebody to me who had gone astray. I mean, he was really one of the most kind of capable, successful people I know. He was a neurosurgeon and, a veteran, and he had, and yet, and he was my grandfather, right? So here I was, a small child that was being told I needed to try to persuade him that his whole life was wrong. He was also a gay man, I'll say that. I go into the book how I came to find that out, that he'd come out later in life. And so there's just this view of the world and of specific people I met in the world that, we were sort of adopting this stance of sort of having the answers. And especially as a little kid, I didn't feel like I had all the answers. I still don't. I still feel like I'm figuring things out. And so to be asked to, impose that in some way on other people, it never sat right with me. And I know a lot of people who are passionate about their faith and want to share it, and I'm sympathetic to that. And for me, when I meaningfully connect with something spiritual, I understand the impulse to share it. But for me, it's never sort of translated into something that specific, like here's the way.
You mentioned the word deconstruction earlier, and I still confess not to being quite clear on how that word is used, especially in social media. I see the word quite a lot, but I'm not quite sure what's behind it. What have you learned from your reporting?
I mean, I think obviously there is a philosophical history behind that word, Jacques Derrida and so forth, which I don't claim to fully understand, because I'm certainly not a philosopher. I don't think people are using it in that context. I think it maybe is vaguely derived from the idea of deconstruction that someone like Derrida would have put forward, but most people are not citing Derrida. They're not talking about anything.
No, I wouldn't have expected that.
Their own experience, and I think I'm not sure how it came to be. It was a word I encountered in the course of my research, in the course of spending time in some of these exvangelical spaces. But the way it's used commonly is just simply a way of referring to the process of sort of rethinking, reevaluating one's beliefs. Questioning and doubting, but I don't think it's even just that. I think it's also, particularly for people who've grown up in some sort of, and here's another label, right, fundamentalist environment. And I often argue that the the line between evangelicalism and fundamentalism I think it's more of a spectrum. I don't think there's a clear line at all.
Yeah.
You may disagree, but I think, there are various degrees of fundamentalism within evangelicalism. And so whether it's, again, going back to my own experience, like the way that I was taught to think about science and reason and just institutional authority outside of the church, having to sort of step back and reflect on, okay, well, I've been told in my Christian school that the Bible, this version of it that is the word of God. It's without error, it's infallible, and it means this, this, and this. And so then you have to step back and go, okay, well, I think it's so much more complex than doubting. It's also just simply reframing your own epistemology in many ways. It's about, well, how do I know that what I know here? How do I know the Bible is true? And even if I accept that it is true or that it's true in some important sense, then how do I know that what I've been told it says is what it says and means? And how do I address apparently conflicting ideas within the text and conflicting interpretations within various Christian traditions? All of these questions that I think go back to the Reformation and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
So I think often when people talk about deconstruction, they're not just talking about like, oh, I had a crisis of faith and I don't know if I believe. It's really about how do I know what I know? And the things that were told me, this entire view of the world that I was presented with as a child, how do I sort of stand aside from it and look at it differently and really address the kinds of questions that an outsider might ask about it, rather than sort of taking those presuppositions as fact.
So it sounds like not a very pleasant experience. It sounds quite uncomfortable to be questioning everything that you've held until.
Well, sure. I don't think it is uncomfortable. But I don't think it's something that people choose to do for fun. I think it's incredibly comfortable.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because it's a word that I remember in a lot of my theological education, my professors using and kind of saying, this is going to feel like a kind of deconstruction early on because you're going to be exposed to a lot of scholarship that questions the things that you've sort of been taught in church. And obviously, like the idea is that there's a kind of reconstruction of some kind that follows that. But I remember feeling very positive about that experience, about having the resources to ask all those questions and follow the trails of arguments and things. And then being kind of surprised at how polarizing the idea was when it happens at a broader scale. I just felt like, yeah, in some ways it's just part of becoming an adult, right? Is like asking questions about where you got these ideas and who you trust and how do you think. And I think for people coming out of more fundamentalist contexts, that can be a really jarring experience. But it's it's the kind of thing that we all maybe go through in our 20s to some degree of just like,
Sure.
yeah, where's all this coming from and how do I know anything?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think, I think you both sort of touch on something important, which is that it often is really, people will describe it as very uncomfortable, very painful. But it doesn't have to be. I think the level of discomfort is almost entirely dependent on your community of origin's stance on questioning or shifting your beliefs. So if you come from a community of origin that demands that you can ask questions, but you really need to come to a certain answer, or that sort of insists on fidelity to a certain set of beliefs to be included or accepted, then I think the process of questioning those ideas is much more painful because there's this feeling that at the end of the road, if it takes you in a different direction, the consequence may be separation from your community. Now, if you're in an environment where questioning is maybe even encouraged or built in, it's very different. I write in the book about, being now in an interfaith marriage. My husband is a Reformed Jew, and his experience with Reformed Judaism in particular is, the thing he talks about all the time. And one of the things that I find really instructive about being exposed to it, and I think this is broadly true of Judaism, many people would say as a philosophy, is that questioning is built into it. The whole Talmudic approach to scripture is about really wrestling with God and wrestling
one
with
big conversation, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and David Gushee, who I don't know if he's ever been on this podcast, but he's
Oh,
Oh,
not
he would
yet.
be a good one, actually.
Yeah.
progressive Christian thinker. He's written and talked about how Christians would really benefit from understanding more about how the Jewish tradition interacts with Scripture, and I really think that's true. But when I go to synagogue with him, our Reform rabbi will take passages apart and has no trouble acknowledging, the Canaanite genocide. That's really difficult, or like that there are passages that we don't take them literally today. We don't base our lives on these things. Instead, we use the text and all the history around it and all the generations of conversation around it to try to understand the world better and understand human nature better, which is a very different approach than what I grew up with in fundamentalist and evangelical churches, where it was this is word for word from God. You must accept it. If it doesn't sit well with you, you're the problem, And so for me, when I'm in an environment where I feel that those kinds of questions, like the elephant in the room, can be discussed, the emperor's nudity can be acknowledged. I find those kinds of spiritual and religious conversations so much more exciting. And
Mm.
there are a lot of people that I think are doing work around that, like the Bible for Normal People, Pete Enns'
Mm.
podcast and books. I find just really exciting, as somebody who wants to be able to call a spade a spade. And when I read a text and there's something that doesn't seem, really doesn't match my modern understanding of the world, that I'm allowed to say so. So I don't think deconstruction has to be unpleasant, but I think that it can be very unpleasant depending on where you're starting from and where you end up. And
Depends
the
on the
key,
community you're in, largely, right? You're saying if they're a
yes,
welcoming
Yeah.
community who encourages you in your questions and supports you, then it's not so bad.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the personal ramifications of that can be, yeah, really devastating for some people, which makes it really, yeah, quite difficult. Yeah, it's interesting too, because I think, for the most part, ancient Christian in biblical interpretation is very similar to Jewish interpretation in that way, right? The church fathers are very open to a variety of possible meanings,
Mhm.
all of these kinds of things. So I think it's quite a modern thing that we get in kind of fundamentalist evangelicalism, this sense of the Bible is about
One
absolute
single final
certainty.
answer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one answer on things,
Yeah.
which does seem to me to play a really big part in exvangelicalism, right? The fact that it's really easy for people to at some point come across something that proves that whatever they were told about some passage of the Bible can't be true, and then suddenly it all unravels because they never had the tools to, really ask those kinds of questions. Um, I appreciate going back a little bit to this idea of kind of needing to fear and save everybody in the world. I think as a teacher, this is one of the things that I see a lot in students who've grown up in evangelical circles. That there's a kind of anxiety about how you engage with non-Christians, all right, about even engaging with kind of non-Christian ideas and texts. Yeah, I thought I really appreciated the kind of clarity that you had when it came to just being honest about. I feel like there was a story where you as a teenager met like a Muslim boy and felt this really strong urge of like, am I supposed to convert him or can I just talk to him, be friends? Like, is that allowed? What does that look like?
Yeah. This
Yeah,
was
I think
a
that's
classmate of mine when I was a Senate page. It was like the first
uh,
time I'd ever really been out of my bubble, and I was with students from all over the country. And yeah, he was the son of Iranian immigrants who'd fled during the revolution in the 70s. And we had these really great conversations. And yeah, one day he just asked me point blank if I thought he was going to hell because he was a Muslim. And I felt like, how am I to answer that question? And it was kind of one of the first, I think, cracks, one of many cracks in the whole thing where I felt like because of the way I was taught, I should have said, "Oh, yes," but that didn't feel not just kind, but it just didn't feel like something I could assert based on my understanding of the world or God or anything else. Um, and so yeah, that I think, but that anxiety about how do you interact with difference was
I
a
find it a
really
really intriguing phrase, this being taught to fear the world and save it, doing both of those things at the same time, which actually it would be hard to do both at the same time. But you feel that there's something in that evangelical culture which is trying to teach you both of those things at once.
yeah. I mean, at least my my experience, and I think if you look at even today, all of the emphasis on sort of culture war, right, on being, and Kristen Kopas-Dumais has written about this so well in her book, Jesus and John Wayne, but I think you can think of many examples in American culture, American evangelical culture, where there's this idea that, Christianity is under attack in some way, or is fighting back against the forces of evil, and so there's this sort of fear of the world, but there's also this impulse to sort of Christianize the rest of the world, and so I think yes, it's fear it and save it, and you're right. I mean, I think that sometimes those impulses or those directives are at odds. I mean, that's one of the reasons I talk in my book about how it's hard to save a world that you fear because you don't understand it. First of all, if you're afraid of it, you're separate from it, you're not really understanding it, and then you're not interacting with people in the same way. It's hard to really truly, I think, connect when your reason for connecting with people is based on that goal. It's not based on just knowing them. And again, not to say that there isn't a way in which people can share their faith or share their spirituality that is based on sort of sincere connection. But, particularly when you're talking about me as a young and sophisticated child, I just felt really powerfully that I was being asked to promote something that I didn't even really understand. I didn't understand myself yet. So how was I supposed to tell other people how to live?
Yeah, that's right.
very
It's a tall
interesting.
order for a young person. I remember thinking the same thing, going out to talk to people and being like, I'm a little bit worried if anyone buys what I have to say because I don't know what I'm talking about. And so why is this my job as a teenager? Yeah. It's you get, I think I see a lot of, because of this, it's kind of anxiety and paternalism, right? You're sort of anxious about the world because we need to change it because it's evil. And also we need to save it. So we're kind of not listening to people about what they need, but sort of telling people what they need. I think, that can be a big part of that culture, which
Um,
people struggle with.
so
Right.
in your research on these ex-evangelical communities, like whole communities of people who gather together after having sort of left behind their evangelical upbringing, do you see any elements that are continuous with evangelical culture or repeated?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of a lot of the communities that exist are virtual. I went in for research for the book. I traveled to Nashville and visited a church that actually meets in person, and is pretty much, they don't really have a theology or anything that anyone has to subscribe to, but they're very evangelical and aesthetic. But a lot of their church is online, and my sense is that to the extent that similar groups exist, a lot of them are happening online, and most of them are kind of small, and then there are fragmented sort of social media groups as well that aren't even purporting to be a church. But I talk about this a little bit in the book. I think there is a danger with any group that when you so I'll just talk about this specifically. I'm not going to generalize beyond it, but evangelicalism in many ways, I argue, is a subculture. There is a sort of set of beliefs, even a way of speaking about things, almost like not a language, but kind of like a language, imagery that we all share. If you grew up in American evangelical culture, you probably grew up listening to some of the same kinds of music as everybody across the country did.
Yeah, that's certainly
Maybe,
true.
yeah, maybe reading some of the same books, dealing with everything that purity culture is. So there's sort of a shared experience, a sort of a subcultural experience. And, I think there is a danger that when people leave that, they take maybe the black and white thinking with them. I've certainly heard that critique, and I've seen and heard about, sort of angry fights on social media between sort of ex-evangelicals over various disputes. And I'm not going to go into all of that because I haven't reported it out in a way that I feel comfortable discussing it. But I mean, there has been some of that. And I think that happens in any group, though. Every group has a tendency to I mean, look at the history of Christianity, right? Every time there's a split, there's another split, and another split, and
Mhm.
people tend to disagree about things. But yes, I think there's some risk of leaving an evangelical church and going, I'm going to go find my people, and then becoming equally rigid in thinking about, your new set of beliefs.
Yeah, it's because that's one of the interesting things I think about the term is that exvangelical sometimes just means people who used to be evangelical, but it also names a new kind of group or these kind of movements that see themselves as a kind of denomination or something. There's a few churches near us that I think kind of see them, they call themselves like kind of post-Christian exvangelical
Mhm.
collectives or something. But they always look to me so evangelical. I'm like, you guys are there's some charismatic leader and you guys it's all like so much of the stuff is the same as the ethos and especially the emphasis on politics is one of the big things that I find, right? People were kind of like raised to be rigorously Republican and that was a big part of their faith, and rejecting that now means just being rigorously Democrats, but no kind of deeper thinking about politics or religion or any of those kinds of things. Sometimes that's what I wonder about the deconstruction thing is like, was there a deconstruction or is it often just sort of a flip-flopping? What's that experience like, and what kind of resources are people using to help them through those kinds of questions?
I mean, and I think that the only thing that evangelical really means to me is it's a way of describing, coming from this culture that I keep talking about, and for whatever reason, no longer identifying with some aspect of it enough to the point where you're like, that's not who I am. And I think a lot of people who grew up evangelical, regardless of how they describe themselves as adults, will find themselves having to, sort of explain like gaps in pop culture knowledge if you were, growing up in a sort of more restrictive, sort of sheltered version of evangelicalism, or just again, like having that shared experience of Christian pop culture, of evangelical pop culture, the youth group experience, all of that. I mean, um, it's at one point white evangelicalism was like close to a quarter of the American public. And so there are a lot of people that kind of come from that culture and have pieces of it that form them. But um, if you're one of the many, many disaffiliated Americans today who comes from that world, I think there's a shared experience, and much in the same way that, if somebody grew up Catholic, people have sort of like ex-Catholic jokes and ex-Catholic
Mhm.
memes and all of that. And I
Because
think,
it's any community that's big enough to have a sort of shadow
right,
group of people who left it and still have all of these things in common.
right,
Yeah.
right. Evangelicalism just happens to be particularly, at least historically in recent history, particularly large and particularly like influential. And so,
Mhm.
I think, if you look at Catholicism, for example, there's a little more room for diversity of politics, for example, because it's such
Mhm.
a, there's such a broad swath of where Catholics land politically. There hasn't been as much of that in evangelicalism. And so I think that's another sort of differentiation that people can find themselves very, alienated. But I think that as, over time, as the country, first of all, as evangelicalism declines along with all other forms of Christianity, and as the country becomes, less affiliated, I think that experience of having been part of this sort of rigid community will become less and less unusual. In fact, I think it
Mhm.
already is. I think, I mean, a part of the reason I wrote the book is that over my adult life, I had met so many people who grew up in some kind of church like this. And, you wind up like in the corner at the party, sort of like trauma bonding about some of the weirder
Yeah.
aspects of your childhood. And they're good ones too, they're good ones too.
Mhm.
But I do think, again, going back to the beginning of our conversation, that what happened in 2016 was a kind of a catalyst for people to have those conversations and have them in public. And,
Yeah.
I, as a journalist, started seeing that and paying attention to it because I was, of course, interested personally, having gone down a similar path. And just, I was just fascinated by the number of books and podcasts and social media groups and things that started sort of burbling up,
Yeah.
where people were talking about
Yeah.
these shared experiences and related themes.
Am I right in understanding though that it exvangelical normally doesn't just denote somebody who's abandoning Christianity altogether? am I right? Is it's normally people who want to hold on to some sort of Christian identity, but not an evangelical one.
Not necessarily. I mean, I talk to
Okay.
people for the book who run the gamut. I mean, people who had found themselves in more progressive churches, like mainline Protestant churches, or sort of these newer iterations of kind of post-evangelical aesthetic, like you talk about. And then there are people who identify as atheists or just, very agnostic. I think sometimes people too seem to need a breather from church, like some people just need to take some time away, and maybe they come back, maybe they don't. But then there are others who, like my friend Jeff Chu, who, doesn't really, I interviewed him for the book because I think he very much fits into this category of being post-evangelical, but he doesn't necessarily use the word exvangelical because it feels a little negative, and he still feels a strong association to church and to Christianity, and recently was ordained. So, I think it runs the gamut, but again, particularly for sort of like millennials and maybe a little older and a little younger, there's just such a shared culture that and I think shared ways of thinking. I mean, a lot of the social media groups that I have lurked in over the years, it's really common to see the same patterns coming up where and this I think exists in other faith traditions too to some extent, but it's helpful to I think get support from people who have a similar experience, which is there are lots of discussions around family, and my parents are having a really hard time with me not going to church, or with me going to a different kind of church, or with my same-sex partner. Like, how do I talk to them? And parents who are just really, really persistent about insisting that their child continue on that exact path. That's a common theme that I see, and I think it's a real struggle for a lot of people, how to negotiate their own adulthood while coming from a community that had, pretty prescribed ideas about what it meant to be included.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a big theme. You talk about that. I forget what magazine it was that sent out the thing about like, for your children aren't talking to you anymore, and it had like steps to, but
Focus on the family. Yeah.
oh yeah, that's right.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I think that has been a kind of a widespread, which goes back to just the the personal cost of kind of wrestling with these things, younger generations. One of the things I was curious about, if you've seen, I think it's interesting reading a lot of books and things from evangelicals. One of the common themes is just like 2016 was a really big turning point for a lot of us, and surely by now, with everything that's happened, you're starting to see the light of our critiques. And then now, and I read your book just before the election, and then Trump wins the election, and the white evangelicals tripled down on him. Do you have a sense of how evangelicals are? It feels like you can't even make that line anymore. It's like, okay, no one actually sees this. Who are we talking to? What does this mean?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't talked to ex-evangelicals specifically about since the election about their views of it, but I think one thing that's happening is that if people increasingly, and like Sam Perry, who's a sociologist at the University of Oklahoma, has written about this, and others have written about this, increasingly, like, if you don't share the politics of the mainstream white evangelical movement, you don't identify as evangelical anymore. So probably part of what's happening is, people aren't using that word for themselves if they are a Trump supporter. So it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's becoming more and more a sociological label than sociopolitical label, perhaps more than exclusively a theological one. I think that shift has been underway for a while, but no, I mean, like, has people leaving evangelical spaces or publicly critiquing them, has that persuaded, the country to become, anti-Trump? Obviously not. But I also don't think that I think that's only like a piece of what evangelicalism is about.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, yes, Trump was reelected. White evangelicals continue to support Trump. Trump picked up support from new demographics that weren't, like, including Latinos to a large degree. So, which I think is really interesting, and I think some of that has to do with Trump's just continued appeal to Well, clearly, he's appealing to working class voters. I think part of it is probably a failure by the Democrats to articulate the concerns of everyday Americans. I mean, clearly, the party didn't succeed at that this year. But I think that, for evangelicals, it's, again, I haven't interviewed anybody about this since the election. The book's been out for almost a year, but it's not just about Donald Trump. So I think it's something bigger. But what is continuing, by most accounts, I think, is the continued decline of American Christianity. I don't know how far that will go. I don't know. And it's not just evangelicalism, it's Christianity, white Christianity across the board. More and more Americans are not identifying with a religious tradition. And I don't know, at what point that will plateau. I assume it will at some point. I myself don't go to church very often, but I do go to synagogue a lot. And I find being in a religious community, even though I'm not fully part of it, to be really meaningful and helpful. But I also know personally how painful it can be to be part of a religious community that feels like it's asking you to do things you don't feel right about, or to represent things that you don't feel align with who you are. And so, I don't know. I think there a lot of people are talking about the epidemic of loneliness in this country and sort of a lack of purpose and meaning. And I think that religion it can be an answer to that. I don't think it's the only answer, and I don't think it's always a good answer, but I think it can be, when done well and when it aligns with people's needs, can really address some of those problems. And so, my goal in writing this book was not to persuade people not to go to church. I hope that's obvious. It was to describe a phenomenon that I was seeing and that I myself had some experience with. But where it all goes from here, I am so curious. I think there's some evidence that younger men are going back to church, even as younger women are leaving. And so there's this gender split that we also see in our politics. And what is that? What happens with that?
Yeah, I think that surprised most people, didn't it?
Yeah.
This sudden flip, because it's almost always been more women than men going to church, not just in the States, but across the world. And this is one of the first times we've seen a flip there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask about if any of your research has gone beyond the United States, or if any of your research has been with people who have a view beyond the United States on evangelicalism?
I really confined this book to the US because I wanted to talk about the political piece of it. Seemed so important. And, when you're doing a project like this, you have to sort of refine your scope. I mean, I interviewed one psychologist from Canada, which I felt was close enough because she had clients from the US. A large number of her clients are from the US. But I am aware that the picture outside the US is very different, especially, I guess the picture in Europe maybe is not that different. Europe has been seeing a decline in Christianity for a long time.
Well, I guess the difference is that in Europe, there isn't really a significant proportion of evangelicals to have any impact on national politics.
Right, right. So the dynamics within different Christian movements are different. Christianity, and I'm talking about Christianity broadly because, as you say, evangelicalism applies in some places, but not others. But Christianity, and I think evangelicalism specifically, are growing in parts of the world, and I think Africa and Latin America, and even in the U.S., a lot of the Latino population, or a lot of the growth in evangelicalism, growth and or stability, depending on which numbers you look at, are in Latino churches, not white churches. So it's really interesting. I'm not an expert on it, but I think.
Well, I don't need to ask you any more about that. I'm just wondering for myself whether the evangelicalism that's growing in the global South and in Latino parts of the States has those same features that the ex-evangelicals found so toxic and harmful in the traditions that they came from.
I think there's some evidence that it has some of those features. And I would point, I think the most extreme example is some of the legislation in parts of Africa that have been very, very oppressive of LGBTQ people. Some of which, my understanding is, again, from reading others reporting, not my own reporting, some of those efforts and movements have close ties to U.S. evangelical leadership. I also know that, I mean, just, looking at the data among Latino voters in the U.S., anecdotally, just from my own a little bit of reporting I've done, it seems that Hispanic evangelicals are more likely to align with white evangelicals politically. Not saying that's necessarily toxic, but just, if one of the issues for a lot of ex-evangelicals is the politics, that I think there's some evidence that's being replicated outside the white evangelical church in other evangelical churches.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And there is certainly in, places like Brazil with Bolsonaro and others, there's, evangelicals have often aligned with the kind of right-wing populist movements in places. So there's, those kinds of connections as well.
But I think it's also important to remember that in our own country, in the U.S., there is, a long history of civil rights activism by the Black church, which, has, of course, a separate history, sometimes very similar theology, but a very different social and political history.
Different politics, yeah.
So it's not to say that even necessarily theologically conservative Christianity is I don't think it's intrinsically like Republican or Trumpy. I don't think it necessarily has to be. But it seems to be easily mobilized for some of those kinds of, right-wing movements.
Yeah, certainly. And certainly at least in the last century and increasingly. Well, maybe one last question. Do you have any positive stories of how your book has been received? I certainly, when I read it, thought that it would be a really good book for, some of the older evangelicals I know who are, maybe worried about or mad about ex-evangelicals. Have you had any kind of stories come out of this?
Yeah, I've actually met and or heard from some combination of both, probably at least 5 or 6. Middle-aged and up readers who have said to me, some version of, I raised my kids evangelical, my kids are angry or struggling about aspects of it, and your book helped me understand why. And, a few people have reached out on social media to say some version of that, and then I've met at least a couple of these people in person at book events in public. And that's always really meaningful for me. Everybody who's reached out has expressed appreciation for, I think, just reading a firsthand account and reading the stories and experiences of a variety of, I'm not even young anymore, but younger than them. I'm probably in between them and their kids' age at this point, a lot of them. But regardless, I think it was helpful for them to sort of kind of get it. Like, this is why certain aspects of this particular kind of evangelical American upbringing can be painful, whether it was growing up in this really restrictive purity culture where, like, everything about sex was shameful and scary, or, whether it was, just being talked to about hell all the time and maybe losing sight of the beauty and the love that Christianity can also be about and should also be about. Whatever the case may be, it meant a lot to me that people seem to come through it with some new insights. In fact, I had a mother and daughter reach out to me recently, and I keep meaning to talk to them, to ask if I wanted to like have a conversation with both of them, because the daughter had given the book to her mother, and her mother was like, this is really helpful. So I think it's also just really nice to see that parents are willing to read it with an open mind and heart and sort of listen and, want to connect. I'm a parent of teenagers now, and I have so much, I think it gives me another gloss on my own experience being parented, when you're parenting complicated people, wonderful, but complicated, fully, human individuals who have their own thoughts and ideas and experiences. And you realize you can tell them what you think and you can give them advice, but they're going to have to be them, and you can shape them, but only to a degree. And so that's been the most meaningful thing, honestly. That, and then just lots and lots of ex-evangelicals who've said, thank you for describing my experience. And to a lesser extent, but also there's a bucket of people who know nothing about evangelicalism and look at American politics and are like, how does this happen? And quite a few people have reached out to say they feel like they kind of get it better now, from a little bit more of what the psychology can be like from the inside. So
well, that's great.
All 3 of those groups of people are people I wanted to reach I'm really grateful that I seem to have reached them.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised. I think I was really impressed by how ironic you are and clear. I think it's very clear the things you're critical of, but you're describing them in a way that even people who aren't critical of those things can see why people might be uncomfortable. And I really appreciated that. And for me, I feel like I experienced so many of the exact same things as you growing up, but I haven't always connected them as clearly as you did. So I appreciated sort of across the gamut of those things, seeing some kind of a web of connections between them, helped me sort of articulate some of those things really well. Yeah, so thank you so much for the book, because I certainly benefited from it. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will as well.
Good. And if anybody is like hearing this conversation and is deeply invested in Christianity, I don't think the book is anti-Christianity. I mean, it's very honest and raw about some of my own experiences and the experiences of other people, but it's not intended to. I'm a journalist, right? And like I'm really happy being in a position where my job is to, as much as possible, describe and explain and analyze and share experiences. And as I say early on in the book, obviously I'm not like a neutral observer here. I think there is a point of view to this book, but it's not written to hit anybody over the head with anything. I have respect for people who come through these kinds of deconstruction experiences, for lack of a better word, as deeply devout Christians, but with their own take on it that's fresh. And I also have respect for people who come out as atheists and say, I just can't do any of it. And everybody in between, because I think, I know people in all of those categories who I think are really trying to understand the world and trying to deal with their personal challenges, personal experiences, trying to make sense of things. And I think that's like one of our most interesting and important jobs as humans, is to sort of ask ourselves, why am I here? And what am I supposed to be doing while I'm here? And that I think is the project of religion. Not everyone arrives at the end of their project being religious, but I still think that they're doing kind of what I see as kind of a religious thing in trying to make those assessments.
Asking the religious question, as it were.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been really fascinating.
Thank you
we really
both. Thanks for all the good questions.
This episode is sponsored by the Palm Beach Atlantic University School of Ministry. Located in the heart of West Palm Beach, Florida, PBA offers a range of undergraduate and graduate programs in theology, Bible, ministry, missions, chaplaincy, and apologetics. Learn more at pbaschoolofministry.com.